Hi, welcome to the Trump Tater podcast. I'm Jamie Renda with Kerry Gibson.
And Pamela Smith.
Today, first we're going to start, what is the Trump Tater? So the Trump Tater, Trump means to outclass, outshine, or outperform others. To defeat someone or something, a dependable and exemplary person. So a Trump Tater is someone who has those characteristics, and the Trump Tater is President Donald J. Trump. Standing in for Donald J. Trump today is our Trump Tater. And so, I'd like to welcome Kerry. Kerry's running for Congress for the 1st Congressional District here in Utah. And we are inviting candidates to join us, because the state delegates right now don't have a chance, and county delegates, to meet directly with the candidates. So we thought we'd have a little fun with politics and get to know our candidates. All the questions that we're going to be asking Kerry and other candidates in the future are all questions that they're aware of ahead of time. So this isn't a chance to trick a candidate. It's a chance just to get to know the candidates so we can get a feel of when it comes to casting our digital vote that we know which candidate we want to vote for. So we'll get started. I think the Trump Tater, the first question is going to be, go ahead, read it for us, Kerry.
How has your experience prepared you to take on the tough issues facing Congress? That's a good question. I wonder who came up with that question.
I don't know.
That's a good one. Well, let me start from the beginning. Maybe fold this into a little bit of an introduction as well. Is that okay?
Okay, that's fine.
I appreciate that, Jamie. So my name is Kerry Gibson. I'm married to the most amazing person on the planet. Her name's Katrina. We just celebrated our 26th wedding anniversary here a couple of weeks ago. I know, it was hard for her. It was easy for me, but 26 years for her is pretty tough. When we got married, I was recently returned from a mission and had just decided that I wanted to come back to my dad's farm, my family farm that's been in our family for 6 generations now. And I was going to school up at Utah State, and she grew up on a kind of a hobby farm, and so she was really excited to marry a farmer. She was one of those few in society who really understood the value of agriculture and why it's important to our society. And she was proud to do her part by being a part of a farm family. And we lived that life for quite a few years. It's the ultimate in small business experience. There's an awful lot that can be learned on the farm, not only business principles, but most people can't make farming work anymore. And so the fact that we were able to make a good living of it for years was something that I was very proud of. But along with that, I got involved in an organization called the Utah Farm Bureau, and they put me through all kinds of cool leadership training experiences and things like that. They helped me to learn how to be kind of an advocate for the industry that I was a part of and that I cared about. I rose through the ranks. I was able to serve on national and state committees, eventually served on the American Farm Bureau board as the chairman of the American Farm Bureau Young Farmer Committee. And one of the coolest experiences was in the year 2001, Katrina and I were chosen as the top young farmers in the nation by the American Farm Bureau, which never happens in Utah. Wow. In fact, we're the only ones that have ever won from Utah because Utah isn't considered a farm state, right? And so we as the winners of that program, the prize was a brand new Dodge truck, bright shiny red with dualies and all the cool stuff that a farmer would love. But right after that, I went into a program called Partners in Agricultural Leadership. And what that was, it was actually a program that I developed as part of the American Farm Bureau Young Farmers Committee. And it was intended to take 10 people from across the nation and explain to them, or teach them, how they could be advocates in their community. So it was this year-long leadership course where we went all over the country and all over the world. They did all kinds of training with us, from sticking a microphone in our face to making us watch back our video presentations and things like that, to how to communicate with people. And I loved it so much. Very last meeting I went to, they came back and said, they looked us in the eye very sternly and said, "We have invested in you. We've now spent a whole bunch of time and energy and money teaching you how to be an advocate for the things you care about. Now go do something with it. Don't just hide it under a bushel, but go do something with it." And that changed my life. I came home, the very week that I came home, I went to my Weber County Republican Party convention, and which I had done every convention since I was about 6 with my family. And as I went into the convention hall, I could hear the rumbling, and then Speaker of the House, Marty Stevens, came up to me and said, "I'm going to run for governor. I would like you to consider running as a state legislator in my place." And so I decided I'd consider it, and the next thing you knew, I had the opportunity to serve there. So I think private business experience, but then on top of that, having the ability to work in large associations. Since then, I've been a state legislator for 6 years. I served as county commissioner for 8 years. I've also run 2 executive departments for the governor. First, when I first went to work for the governor, it was as the deputy director of the Department of Natural Resources, which I absolutely loved, dealing with wildlife and water and oil, gas, and mining and state parks and just all that cool stuff. And then the governor called and said, "I need you at the Department of Agriculture. I'd love you to serve there." And I was able to serve there as well. So I think in this race, there's going to be a lot of different skill sets, but I think bringing it all together, there's no one in the race that's had any legislative experience other than myself. No one else has served in a legislative body. No one else has served in an executive branch role like I have at the state level. So there's some county officials and some city officials, but I think that that breadth of experience, having been able to see so many of those things and how those levels of government work together, really set me apart from the group. Congressman Bishop has said to me many times, "Gosh, whoever replaces me, it'd be really good if they had state and local government experience." And I think the reason he says that is because, as you know, he has been a fierce federalist, someone who believes that the federal government has taken too much authority and power from state governments. And in order to really be able to fight back and say, no, this is a place for the local governments, state or local, you have to have been able to see that. You have to have been in those circumstances. I myself have been in the place in a state executive office where I have seen the federal government step in way too closely to the roles that we should be playing.
Let's go into some questions specifically to find out
Great.
what, how this
Yes.
experience will help
That
you.
was
So we'll
Yeah.
start with
Great.
the next question that Trump Tater has.
Okay.
Is, go ahead and read it for us, Kerry.
Common Core has been a disaster. Amen. What is your vision on how we move forward? How we move forward on education? I think that's a typo, but I think I understand the question.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, in the first case, I will agree with you that Common Core has been a disaster, and this is exactly one of those experiences I've been talking to you about. Education is critically important to every family in our district and in our state. And this is one of those things that belongs clearly in the hands of state governments.
Well, let's just talk for a minute. How has Common Core been a disaster from your perspective?
Well, again, when someone far away from the realities of home makes a decision for us and tells us what should and shouldn't be done, it makes it takes away the opportunity for real ingenuity, real creativity, and what we've learned over and over again in education is that one size does not fit all, and sometimes it's a square peg and sometimes it's a round peg, and you have to be able to adapt to those situations on the ground. And so we have different demographics, different issues that face us in Utah than they do in Washington, D.C. And unfortunately, the bureaucracy is built in such a way that decisions are made at the Department of Education in D.C. with our own tax money that we have sent, and then they determine at some point if we're worthy enough to receive some of that back to address some of our own challenges based upon the things that they think are important. And it's not necessarily things that we think are important. And so education is one of those things that is clearly under the Constitution a state mandate, something that states are in charge of, and states would be wise to push that direction as much as possible, even lower to the local levels, to districts. Now, granted, there have to be some state regulation and things like that, but there really isn't a place for education on the federal level, from my perspective.
Well, but what really brought Common Core, I think, into play is, I mean, it was really a data collection. A data collection. I don't know if you were in the Congress or in the legislature at the time when it was kind of foisted upon us. And I think that what was of great concern to me was the parental rights, because then the parents, it's kind of a fight between, do the parents have the right to choose for their children, or do the governing bodies have a right? And so I know that Rob Bishop spoke pretty clearly to our legislators about that, but now that it's going to be, I mean, what was before us, they said, oh, well, this is a disaster. Well, now we're calling Common Core a disaster. What do you see as a solution then?
Well, the solution is first of all for the states to take the authority that they rightfully have, and for them to develop the curriculum and the reporting requirements that the federal government usurped in the first place.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like I said, as long as we advocate that authority and give it back and allow the federal government to take it, then they will take it, because there's a financial incentive for them to do
Right.
so. And that's one of the challenges with Congress as a whole. I think most of the time people get into a congressional role, they really do want to help, but somehow they think that they've been endowed with more knowledge than a state legislature. And the reality is that's not true. I mean, the states are the laboratory of creativity, and they are independent, sovereign states. And so the federal government really needs to know when to, they need to figure out when to back off more than they need to figure out when to get involved. And that's one of those reasons why I think, having worked at all these different levels of government, both executive and legislative experience at the state level as well as the local level, I've seen in every one of those circumstances things just like Common Core that have reached in and completely made no sense. For instance, our public lands management, as at the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Natural Resources, I'm telling you right now, the federal government is way too involved with the management of our local lands.
Absolutely.
And when they do that, they tend, again, to make a decision from a desk somewhere where they are not on the ground. They do not see, they do not understand what really is best for that land. Yes, they have experts, but those experts don't have any common sense when it comes to the actual day-to-day management of those lands. And I have dealt with that issue for the last 20 years. There really isn't anybody, again, in this race that understands public lands or that's really been involved in the public lands fight. I've been involved with it for 20 years, both from my experience in the Farm Bureau. As a county commissioner, I was the president of the Utah Association of Counties, and my job was to watch out for our southern Utah and public lands counties and figure out how to help them have some autonomy during these terrible situations. So what have we seen? We've seen devastating fire loss and devastating loss of income and livelihood. The sawmills have completely shut down in southern Utah. You have a county like Garfield County, who has 2,500 people in it. Their main source of revenue was a couple of sawmills, and they have been shut down. They can't even fund their school. 2,500 people in a county that's 97% owned by the government. 3% of that tax base cannot fund a county operation.
Yeah.
It just can't do it. And so it's...
Well, weren't our trust lands supposed to take care of the education?
Well,
Originally designed by...
that they were designed as an additional piece. They were never intended to be the whole source of education, not even close. In fact, the state trust lands is an agency that I worked very close with at the Department of Agriculture as well. They have done tremendous things with that resource, have been able to bring an additional amount of money to the education system. But no, they were never, there was never nearly enough trust lands provided to kind of compensate the states for the loss of that federal land. What was originally meant to compensate somewhat was this concept of PILT. Have you ever heard of payment in lieu of taxes? They call that PILT, and that's basically where the federal government said, we know that you can't tax federal land, so we're going to give you a fraction. It turns out, I call it pennies in lieu of taxes because that's what it turns out to be. But a fraction of what they could have earned in taxes back as a payment to help those local governments succeed.
That sounds like race to the top in Common Core.
Exactly.
You throw in all your money and you say, hey, if you can vie for that, you can get your money back. And we never get our money back. It was the promise of money, but we never received. Utah didn't.
And here's the problem in the Enabling Act in the Constitution. Our lands were supposed to be returned to the states. They were supposed to be managed by the states all the way along, and they were systematically from the east to the Midwest, and all of a sudden, just before what we call the federal fault line, where the federal government quit returning that land to the states, all of a sudden it just stopped. And Utah now is number 2, only behind Nevada as having the most federally owned land. And again, it puts us at a tremendous disadvantage when it comes to educating our children. That's really the big thing that most of us really need to understand that it affects, that we don't get. We don't understand why we struggle with education funding in the state of Utah, and that's the biggest reason, because we can't tax most of our land.
Okay, I have one question before we go on.
Yes.
Pam brought to my attention, and I didn't realize this, so maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, that part of this Common Core and the data collection is these student records are sent on to the federal government in a database as part of the Common Core, which means behavioral, grades, everything else are stored permanently. Do you know if that's accurate?
I don't know that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
So if it is, I mean, we have like these athletes that have came out recently that some tweet that they made when they were 15 or 16 is destroying their careers. I mean, people never have a chance to transform themselves and into, we all make mistakes, but if those mistakes are documented in a student's records that stay in a government
And the
database,
student does not have the right to go and see their own records.
So they don't even
Parents-
know what's in it?
They don't know what's in it. It's been assessed by the professionals, but who deems them more professional than others? But you cannot change those records. I have it here.
And so if that
I
is
believe
the
it.
case, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, as a congressman, would that be something that you would feel it's important to put a time limitation on how long the federal government or Common Core, hopefully we're going to get rid of Common Core, but for the years that we've been on it, that those records can be kept, because everyone deserves a chance to transform, put the past in the past, and we live in a digital age right now that those records stay with us, and if the federal government's holding on to it, yes, there's private, but we all know how data breaches work.
I agree. The reality is juvenile records are expunged all the time and for good reason. And this seems like a similar case. At the end of the day, the best idea would be to just end it and bring education back to the state level like it should be. But you're absolutely right.
That's
I didn't
the
know
ideal,
this was a case.
isn't it? The ideal.
And sometimes, I'm glad that you bring this up, because sometimes you do have to work systematically
You
to get
do,
somewhere.
because No Child Left Behind was just, according to the superintendent, Martel Menlove, he said that we were using the exact same computer rubric or measuring sticks and everything that they were using and they just moved them right over to Common Core, but it was basically the same. And so we're just going to repackage it, make it a little sweeter on the outside,
Take
but it
away the
might be the
poison
same.
name.
Yeah, take away the poison name.
The Trump Tater wants to know, what are your thoughts on our homeless population?
So the homeless population is real. It's an issue that is important for us to deal with. As a county commissioner in Weaver County, it was one of our real issues that we dealt with. It was an issue from the standpoint of not only community health, but the health and welfare of these individuals. And let's remember, they are individuals. They are people. For whatever reason, it's easy to look down on them and say that they're different than us, but they're us that have come across and fallen on hard times. and sometimes of choice of their own, but again, which ones of us have not made poor choices that could have led to disaster
And
if we're not
oftentimes,
careful?
Kerry, not choices of their own at all. There's a
Choices of their parents, or,
Yep.
yeah.
Well, sometimes it's
It's
just, one of the things that I think we as a society take for granted is IQ.
Yeah.
And IQ is one of the biggest determining factors of being successful. That and awareness or conscientiousness of in a job. So there's a certain part of our population that is born with an IQ that's below a functioning level. And so I think when we look at homeless, we have to look at all the different factions of the homeless population. It's not a one, like you said, they're all individuals, so it's not a one fix for all of our homeless population.
For sure.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
as a county commissioner here in Weber, we had our own unique challenges, and I'll be happy to get into those if you'd like. But I also was the president of the Utah Association of Counties during the time that the JRI, or Justice Reinvestment Initiative, was working its way through the legislature. And of course, there's strong ties to the homeless population and the incarcerated, right? And so that was quite an experience for me to understand from a statewide level, all the way through, from southern Utah all the way to the top of our district, what is really, really important as far as being able to help people rehabilitate themselves and put them in a place of being productive. I have to admit, one of the things that I'm really impressed about you is that you take a chance on folks that come from the halfway house, that have been felons, and they're coming looking for a job, and they have to do something like that in order to succeed. They have to be able to work their way back into society. And unfortunately, I think one of the challenges that we face here locally is that we have a large halfway house where most of the halfway house inmates from the entire state end up coming through Ogden. And they come into this facility and they're kind of warehoused, and they come out every day looking for a job. And so the area right around is kind of hit hard. You probably get more people come by than you can possibly hire, right?
Absolutely.
And yet, by the same token, it's not the best model for them to be able to rehabilitate themselves. And so that was the kind of the thought behind the JRI system and process, is that not only do we change how we incarcerate people, but we change how we rehabilitate them, both in the prison system and then afterwards as well. And remember, as they come through this halfway house system and move out into the real world again, they really need to have a support system.
Absolutely.
And so if you take someone who was incarcerated in Washington County, mom and dad and sister and brother and church family are all in Washington County. They're incarcerated. Now they got a new family, maybe not quite as friendly as the old
Right.
family, right, in the prison system. And then they're in the halfway house in Ogden. Where's that support system? It's still in southern Utah, right, or Provo, or wherever. It's not that mom and dad don't care, but they can't bridge that gap. And so I can tell you what, as a young person myself, when I had problems, if I needed to fix those problems, who did I lean on? I leaned on my family, my friends, my church, my community. Those were the people that cared about me. And right now, when you have them so separated from a situation like this, it's pretty tough for them to be able to figure out who they can count on. So what do? They lean on the family that's around them that may not, be in the same place of those that can truly help them to rehabilitate. And so it's a real problem that's just part of the problem. I see it a lot here in Ogden because of the halfway house situation, but it speaks to the larger issue of that we need to be aware, both in the prison system and then after, how to move these people into an opportunity that they can truly succeed. And a lot of that has to do with their natural support system.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about prison reform, and maybe that's going to be the next question, but let's talk about the homeless a little bit more. Pam, can you share a little bit about some of the efforts that you've put into?
Well, in just the last 5 years, we've gone to Ogden, and because a lot of the government organizations or even volunteer, they're nonprofit, but they close for the weekend. And so we fill in a spot, and we call it the Park Family Ministry, and we actually, there's a pastor that comes and he shares a message of hope We look them in the eye, and I'm in charge of providing the meal. And what started out with just my husband and I has blossomed into a lot of volunteers. It's a little tricky right now with everything closing down, but we still have been able to provide meals. And what they really appreciate is they feel like someone really cares. They're not just, again, a cookie cutter going through a system on an assembly line of reform. They're actually working towards change, real change, and seeing, seeing someone that actually believes in them. I've heard about Arizona that they have actually a tax credit, and they have a fund where different organizations, not paid organizations, voluntary, but they are able to use some of those funds to help these guys, men and women, get back on their feet. And I wondered, I wanted to ask you about that. If you thought it's not a tax deduction, it's a tax credit. It's up to $800, and anyone can do it. But it's actually given a huge state fund that they are helping a lot of people there.
Well, I actually like the idea of a tax credit. I like the idea of what you're doing. I love the concept of volunteers and people being willing to help. I think what we miss in society nowadays is that there are good people around that want to help and would love to be a part of this type of relief. Unfortunately, because government thinks they have to do it all themselves, that again hinders the volunteerism because we think, okay, they're taken care of, and we don't get as involved as we should. And so I applaud you for being willing to show leadership on that issue. There are certain human needs in life, and one of them certainly is a sense of someone trusts me, someone believes in me. I just last night, as part of our sequester, my daughter, for one of her school assignments, had to watch the show Les Mis, and so I was watching that with her, trying to win Father of the Year right now, since I haven't been around much lately. And it struck me how Jean Valjean came was found by this priest. And the priest offered him a place to stay after others had shunned him, and
society had shunned him.
The whole society, absolutely, and society treated him very harshly and didn't give him a chance. This person showed him that he cared. That didn't mean his bad habits were gone. In fact, to be honest, he was so hungry again that he immediately stole from the priest.
Went back to his old
habit. Was then apprehended. They brought him back to verify. And the priest said, "No, I forgot to give you this one as well."
Yeah.
And then to see how it completely changed his life. What a wonderful thing. And that goes back to this concept of when someone believes in you, when someone offers up true confidence that you can do something good, it's a wonderful thing, isn't it? And it gives us the ability to go on and do amazing things. And so that's the thing that really is going to make a difference. We're not going to take care of people by simply giving them money.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work.
People have to have a meaning or a purpose in their life.
Exactly.
One of the things I'd like to talk about is the chronically homeless, because obviously we talked about prison reform, and most of the people from prison reform don't have to be chronically homeless.
True.
But there's a segment of the homeless population that are chronically homeless. And one of the things I have discovered in working with them is that if we gave them a housing voucher and put them in an apartment, it would kill them off.
Yeah.
Because their social engagement is with their friends at the park and on the streets. And these are people oftentimes that are disabled, that mentally can't function at a level that we could find some meaningful work of some kind for them to do. So I think we have to approach that segment of our homeless population in a way, how can we create a community, an affordable community, where they can still maintain that community connection, and we as a society can afford to have them in a house and in a sustainable place where they can live, because they're going to be long-term homeless. But we can't take that factor out of it, is that community connection is very important. And even if we offered a housing voucher, somewhere in North Ogden or South Ogden, they're probably not going to sustain that long term. Yeah. And so we've got to to me, I mean, after doing this for years, so we've got to take the different homeless populations and find a solution for the chronically homeless that if they're going to be homeless, it's something that they can't necessarily function completely to ever take care of themselves, but that community impact is so important to them. Well, let's talk prison reform. This is an important topic for our Trump Tater. So I would like to just share a little bit with you on how I feel on prison reform, and then you can give me your views on how you think we ought to approach. Prison reform has been a passion of mine for a long time because I'm a pro-life person.
Yeah.
And if we value life from inception, or we value life in the womb, and we do not believe in assisted suicide as conservatives normally, I'm not saying all conservatives, so we should have valued life. That's oftentimes the potential is rotting away in our prison system. So there's a fine balance, because some crimes are definitely crimes that have a victim to it.
For
And
sure.
that victim has to have some sort of justice. And then there's many crimes that are victimless crimes. Violated laws or ordinances, drug crimes, things of that nature. Anyway, this has been something that I see as a very conservative issue. A lot of my conservative friends think I'm kind of nuts on it.
Well, they grew up in the era of the war on drugs and
Yeah.
things like that.
Well, and even that, the war on drugs, I mean, we have a disproportionate punishment for a rich man crime versus a poor, rich man drugs versus poor man drugs.
Right.
White collar crime versus blue collar crime. And some of that, like white collar crime, they say, well, there's not this traumatic thing, but there really is. It's a state, you know, when you lose your life savings to someone who has taken your life savings through some type of, bank fraud or some other type of fraud. No, they didn't hold me up at 7-Eleven and took $200 out of my, bank account or whatever. But that sustained mistrust in society
Absolutely.
is just as traumatic. It's not as a one-time, offense that, scares you and you feel fearful of your life, but the sustained trauma over a period of time is just as great, or I feel it's just as great, because I've known people who've lost everything to someone who has been manipulated them out of their life savings. And so that's just one instance. The same with sexual crimes. We have these school teachers, a whole lot of female school teachers right now. I don't know where they're coming from, but it seems like every time I see one, it's a female school teacher. And they're in a position of authority, they're in a position of trust, and they molest somebody over a period of time, sometimes multiple students, multiple youth, and they oftentimes get 2 years in prison. And so I'm not undercutting someone who rapes someone, because again, they have a victim, and that victim deserves their perpetrator to pay the cost for that. But the disproportionate time somebody spends in prison for a rape versus a molestation, but especially someone that's a school teacher. So anyway, I'd like to talk about not just prison reform, but actually the disproportionate prison terms for different types of crimes that I think are equivalent, even though that we as a society have put into two different categories and have not treated equivalent. So anyway, I'll let you take it from there and tell me what you think.
Well, first of all, to use one of your examples, sexual assault is never appropriate, regardless of who it is, and certainly from someone who is in a position of trust. It's a terrible thing, one way or another. And the President Trump has led the way in this overall issue of criminal justice reform and reforming the system, and that's been a fun thing to watch. I think you have seen it become normalized now as a conservative issue, something that matters to conservatives because of the leadership that the president has shown. When it comes right down to it, we have to be more consistent. We have to be more even-handed across the board in our criminal sentencing, and that's one thing that it kind of ebbs and flows with society, right? Times change a little bit, and people show a certain amount of outrage over this or that. Or I mentioned earlier the war on drugs, right? Where where there was a time when that was the only thing that mattered, right? We have to eliminate the drug problem because it was killing our families, and we understand that. And so, but then there was a direction that it kind of went, and it went, right? And it was carried out dramatically. Now we're starting to see that maybe some of that was disproportionate, right? It wasn't as even as it could have been. And so I think we just have to constantly be evaluating and looking at an ever-changing world, an ever-changing situation, and making sure that we're, first of all, being fair, and that second of all, that we as a community are seeing results and outcomes that actually make sense from the policy that we do have. And that's one of the things that I think has driven this prison reform and this the discussion on this fairness issue quite a bit lately, is the fact that we've stepped back and said, hey, things aren't in the right place right now. They're not. And so that takes a large discussion in state legislatures and federal legislature for sure, and then a policy that reflects that.
What will be the number one thing that drives you?
In the race as a whole?
And as
a congressman as a whole?
Mhm.
Oh, wow. That one, that's a really good question. Well, let me say this. From a child, I have had this deep passion for service. I think it was something that was ingrained in me from my parents as one thing, but I think also it was something that maybe I was born with a little bit, that came in my heart. And there is nothing better in any of the public service that I've done than being able to help someone. And helping someone, I have found over time, is not always mean giving them something.
Exactly.
In fact,
I like
most of the
that.
time it doesn't mean giving them something. It means helping them in a way that's different than giving a handout, because it's about what comes from inside. And so I think that's a tough one, but what drives me is being able to serve in a way that I feel like I'm uniquely trained for and uniquely bred for it, for lack of a better term, because it's where my heart is. And so I love the opportunity to serve. I love being able to take on tough challenges and come out with a solution. I loved my service in the state legislature when I had the opportunity to take what might have seemed like a crazy idea at the time and all of a sudden figure out, oh, this will work. And then have to go convince 104 other people who thought it was, or 103 other people who might have thought it was crazy to begin with, and then all of a sudden come up with a solution. And at the end of the day, just sit back and think, oh, we made a difference today. Let me just give you an example. In all my years of public service, probably one of the very best experiences I ever had was taking care of and helping a young family to sorry, I can't even hardly bring this up without being a little emotional, but who had their child taken away from them in unfair and unreasonable circumstances by the state of Utah. They were accused of all kinds of terrible things, none of which were true, but the state had the authority to take this child because they could. And someone had a beef and attacked this family to the point that they could not function, and they were torn. They were torn to pieces. And being able to help through the state system to bring this family back together, and in the meantime fix the process that then made sure that it would not happen again in the future under those similar circumstances.
Was that a medical kidnapping? Is that what you?
No, it was a little more specific than that, but and I can't get into a lot of the details right now, but it was just one, as I worked through that situation, it was one of those things that I look back on after 15 years now and think to myself, if I don't do one more thing in public service, that was worth it. So I will admit, those are the kind of things that drive me to service, because I care about people, and I care about helping them to get things done. Now, that being said, in public service, you're going to be attacked, and One of the reasons why it's important that I've had opportunities to serve in other areas is because, frankly, as miserable as it is, I have been attacked. In fact, you might have people come on this show and attack me again, and that's okay, as long as they do it respectfully. But the reality is, when you do something hard, it's possible that you get attacked, and you have to know how you're going to react in those situations. So here's the challenge. When people come on this show and they say, this is what I will do, that's one thing. But I have a record of being able to say, this is what I have done. And I have learned one thing about myself, that as much as I have a heart and I care about people tremendously, when I'm attacked for doing something right, I don't buckle. I stand up straight into the wind and fight. And I'm proud of that, because we have to be able to do that. Even when some people will not have all the information, they won't care to get all the information.
Absolutely.
You have to be able to put your chin into the wind and do what is right. And I've served in a few capacities enough to know that I know how to do that.
So I'm going to transition into one of our last questions, and we've got a couple of statements that the Trump Tater would like to make. But back on the...
Is he going to whisper those in my ear?
He's got some sign language going. So back on prison reform, just kind of a transition here. Our economy was just rocking, and we were at a place in our economy where people were welcoming some prison reform because we had jobs for people to come out to, and so it was something that could be a positive transition because immediately somebody could come out of the halfway house, have a job. Wow, 3 weeks later, it's like boom.
Gone, yeah.
So the next question is, what is your vision on bringing our nation together and moving America forward during this crisis?
Well, this one certainly is one for the books, isn't it? I mean, this crisis has been fast moving. I mean, I'm not sure that any of us even have our arms around this yet. I certainly don't completely. Every time I think I do, something changes. I will tell you this, I appreciate the president and his willingness to understand, yes, action is necessary, but we can hurt people through an economic crisis just as bad as we can through a viral crisis. And in this particular case, I think we're already on the verge of the treatment maybe being more damaging than the virus itself.
Yeah,
Kerry,
the
I'm
remedy.
going to interject here because I own a restaurant, and I feel like most restaurant owners have been very agreeable and say, hey, we got to do our part, like other parts of the community have to do theirs. So obviously there's been a lot of restrictions on restaurants. We can no longer serve people inside our restaurant, but I had 4 outdoor tables.
Yeah.
That I set outside, and we spread them apart, even like if it's cold, but we've had a few nice days here and there. So we set the tables up and we had them 10, 12 feet apart. So if a family comes in, they shouldn't say come in, they come and they call in, make an order, and we give them their order. They might set out the table, or construction workers down the street. But I was informed today that I can no longer set my outside tables up. And I'm thinking to myself, because I went to the Smiths yesterday, and the deli line was 15 people around me.
No question.
The wait in line to check out, every self-check
How far
was
apart
being
were they?
used. Oh, they weren't far apart at all. We were all, there was no, I had this tape
Social
that goes down in my
distancing.
drawer, not in my store, not in my drawer, a blue line that customers have to stand back when they enter in, that they can't get close to there's none of that in Smith's. Had my hair done.
Looking
And
nice.
The salon was full, 40 people in there, and then Home Depot. So it's just kind of some unfair restrictions, but regardless, I don't want other business shut down. But when you're talking outside, and people are, and I don't do it for us as a restaurant, I do it because I feel like people need an opportunity to come grab, eating is something, one of the enjoyments we have in life right now. And to be able to come with your family or your spouse or your child and sit down and eat your food at a table in the nice sunshine outdoors. If it's
I have numerous
properly-
people that have been calling me, and they are
Yeah.
very lonely. They're
Yeah.
isolated.
There's no question.
It's a very
So,
difficult time. for
the
them.
health department said to me, well, we want people to self-isolate. I said, well, anybody that comes in to pick up a meal and they're with someone drove in the same car,
Yeah.
or they walked from the same office. I said, strangers aren't gonna sit down and eat at the same outdoor table together. So I don't understand the purpose. I feel like we're isolating, like you said, the solution may be more detrimental than the problem. We're isolating people so much that even the ones that I feel like are within the realm should be readily acceptable, being able to eat outdoors in a a place that's distanced far apart. So I don't know, I'm looking at my line in the sand of, you know, where am I gonna draw that line on where I'm gonna just blindly follow what the government tells me to do in this crisis?
Well,
And
Congress
so-
is still meeting.
Yeah, and
I'll
I
bet a
guess
few
that
of
goes
them.
to the state delegates there too. I mean, Congress meets in large groups. State delegates have been elected by their peers to perform a very important service. And we're being deprived any opportunity of having that one-on-one experience. But
There's
yet,
no
our,
question.
our leaders are meeting and we're elected officials. I believe that wholeheartedly. As a state delegate, we're elected to represent and define and vet the candidates so that we
No
can have the
question.
best candidate there. So anyway, just, I guess the line in the sand, at what point, we wanna be team players, but there's gotta be some point we as Americans say, you know, you're expecting too much there. So,
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, I'm not sure where the line is, but I can tell you, it is heartbreaking to me to see the devastation that is happening today. I will share an example of a friend that I have that from the Salt Lake area who was an immigrant to this country, actually came across as one of the Vietnamese boat people. With a large family, had no ability to speak the language, no ability to communicate, no ability to really do anything to protect themselves, and created a restaurant business and 4 or 5 restaurants, and were doing very, very well because they had come to this country, done things the right way, taken advantage of the American dream as we all want to do so, done things that I'm not sure I could have done as an individual under the circumstances, and now are completely devastated by this crisis when your entire life's work is wrapped up into a few restaurants that then we're being told there's no flexibility, it's just done. It's a painful situation, and I will just say individual liberties are important even when government has good information for us. We've got to maintain individual liberties and individual responsibility to a certain level. And I think, unfortunately, the trend has been away from that. It's been to
At an alarming rate.
at an alarming rate to push those liberties aside for the promise of safety and security of
Yes.
some point. And that safety and security can very seldom be provided in the way that the government promises to do so.
Amen to that.
And so we have a duty, I think, as individuals to stand up when the time is right and take that responsibility upon ourselves and not expect the government to do it for us.
That's
To
right.
take good information, to inform ourselves, as you mentioned, as a delegate, to inform yourself about the candidates. Even when the candidates can't be in your living room like they used to be, you've got to figure out how to do that. And so I applaud you for this opportunity, because I think it tells the story of what we need to do. But I will just say this, from a federal level, the federal government gets involved in way too many things. National security, national defense, and at the risk of saying something too inciting at this point, I will just say that I think we might find out that this whole virus thing may have more to do with national defense at the end of the day than we thought it might.
Yeah.
Because I think we're finding out more and more information all the time that worries me about the whole way that it happened. But outside of that and just a few other things as outlined in the Constitution, which most people forget to exist anymore, the government's answer in so many cases is to promise people everything and create this kind of nanny state from cradle to grave, and the only reason it works is because we as individuals
Allow
it to happen.
we're willing to sacrifice a freedom or liberty in exchange for that.
We
So-
think
Someone-
that we will gain it.
So-
Someone
a
someone
former
is
prime min-
mentally ill.
Yeah.
Sorry, but someone is mentally ill, and yeah, it's a scary thing. But then So we go take all the guns out of the entire family's hands?
Exactly.
I mean, no, I'm sorry, but it's not going to happen in my house.
The government was established to uphold our God-given rights. And I think that's what you're hitting on, and I think
Exactly.
that's right. It's not the right of government, no matter what the remedy is promised,
It's true.
it's not worth.
Couldn't agree
One
more.
quick question before we go to some of our closing thoughts. Just recently, one of the former prime ministers of England suggested that we need a one world solution. And in that implication, there was a lot of wording that implied a one world government. And I kind of, when this situation happened, I thought, man, they've done everything they could to take down President Trump. They've done everything they could to make it where Brexit wouldn't happen. And both of those things have happened. And I'm not saying this virus was intentional, but I thought, there's that thought process behind a lot of liberal thinking is never let any good crisis
Go to waste.
go to waste.
Yeah,
So all of a sudden this prime minister's mentioning, a one world solution. So what is your thought? I like that President Trump said, hey, we don't want outside help. We're going to take care of this from within our own country. So what is your thought on that?
Is that same mentality that I just described. We are the greatest nation on the face of the earth. We are the only, a true democracy has never succeeded. We are a republic. We have succeeded because we have maintained the principles in the Constitution that allow us to be successful. And if we turn to the rest of the world for solutions to our problems, we find ourselves just like individuals who cede their individual liberties to a state or a nation. I had an opponent in this race just recently at a town hall meeting that called himself a globalist. I'm not a globalist. I'm an American, and I'm proud to be an American. I'm grateful that
I think that's one of the greatest criticisms that Donald Trump has faced. He is a nationalist. He is not a globalist, and that is. Some might see it as a vice, but an American. He's a true American. He believes in American traditions and in the Constitution. And
I agree that I agree that I know that I'm blessed by God to have been put in this place. There's no question. But part of it is the fact that we have made choices that have helped maintain our freedoms.
Amen.
And the minute we stop making those choices and we start making the opposite choices that have the exact opposite result, we have no choice but to live with those consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And I just say thank heaven for rural Utah, for rural America, for farmers and ranchers, for people who harvest a product out of the earth and mine it, for people who make their living on the land, whatever it is, that allow this country to continue to be strong and independent. Because unfortunately, and I hate to, I'm not calling anyone out here, but it's this mentality that you see sometimes in the larger cities, right? In the tremendously urban areas where people start to believe, and the governments start to believe, that they should be responsible for individuals from cradle to grave.
Mm-hmm.
And this rugged individualism and independence that has made this country what it is today is missing from our society in so many ways, and I'm just proud to be a part of that type of rural Utah.
That's a perfect
Awesome.
transition to something that Trump Tater wanted to remind Americans of. That in this time that we don't want to get in a state of despair, because if we do, our country's going to go with it.
True.
But we are stronger than we realize, and we're more resilient than we believe. And so I think that's important for all Americans, that our economy can quickly come back with the right attitude, because we are strong. And
we will be.
and we're resilient.
There is no question. At the end of the day, we have been through these types of crises before, and we will have them in the future. And there is no question, again, as I mentioned before, once we know who we are, we know, we learn from our past, we know what's inside us, and we can look to the future. we can solve these problems. We can, and I have great hope. I mean, as I get a little bit emotional thinking about the challenges of those that I care about, that's okay, because that drives me to action. That drives me to being able to stand up and say, and know that we are strong. My forefathers came across the plains in a terrible situation, something that I couldn't even understand how they could function in a situation like that, and made life what it is for me today. And my promise and my goal to my kids and their kids and their kids is that we will do the same for them. That we won't leave them in a place that's worse. We will leave them in a place where there's more freedom, not less.
Now, on a closing note, I just want to talk about what a tater is versus a hater. So the Trump tater is a doer. It's a solution finder. So we're going to end, if we can all join the Trump tater together and say,
Be a tater, not a hater.